see if we have time for that. So with that, we'll turn it over to Karin.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, members of the applicant review panel and alternates also for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I'm not going to bore you too much. We're talking about data. Some people hear data, their eyes glaze over. Hopefully this is not going to be a very painful presentation, and maybe you'll learn something. And so let's get started. Redistricting California, an overview of data and processes to aid the evaluation of applicants. The goal here, of course, is to give you a little bit of an overview of what the eventual commissioners need to know and what they're going to face and what they're going to confront when they're doing their work. And hopefully that will help you pick people that will be uniquely qualified to do that work. My name is Karin McDonald. I'm the director of the statewide database. I'll tell you a little bit about this later. I'm here with my colleague, Jaime Clark, who's right here, and she's going to be taking over in maybe an hour and a half or so. And I'm going to do the dry piece. So I'm going to tell you about the data, and then Jaime has the fun piece where you're actually going to see how these data are put together, how maps are made, and she's going to go through criteria and so forth and illustrate the things that I'm going to tell you about. So let's get started. The statewide database is the redistricting database for the state of California. We are located on the UC Berkeley campus at Berkeley Law. Our website is https://statewide-database.org. For those of you who were around the last time, the statewide database, of course, has been around, but this is a new website for us. And also our email addresses have changed. We're all first name @statewide-database.org. This may come in handy if you ever find yourself at an urgent need to get some redistricting data. So please just feel free, first name @statewide-database.org, and here we are. We're open 24/7, at least the website is, and maybe not necessarily the email, but we do our best to get back to everybody very quickly. I'll tell you a little bit, just 2 minutes about Jaime's and my background so that you can figure out whether you really want to listen to us. I have been working at the statewide database as its director since roughly 95. It's getting to the point where I'm kind of not talking about that anymore so much because it's definitely dating me. So I have, quite a few years of experience with data, with redistricting data, with different data sources that go into redistricting data. I've done a bunch of research on criteria and how criteria interact, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of these projects in the course of this presentation. And Jaime has only been around for a little bit over 10 years and has also a lot of actual redistricting experience. She has drawn lines on the statewide level with commissions, with the Citizens Redistricting Commission, and also on the local level with local commissions, and then also with non-commission based redistricting bodies. And I've done the same. So if you have any questions about that, of course, ask us later. An overview of this session, and this is not necessarily in the order this will happen, but roughly we'll probably jump around a tiny little bit. I'll introduce data that are used in redistricting. I'll provide some context for qualifications of the applicants that the applicant review panel members will look for. Try to provide some realistic examples of how these qualifications may be applied. And then we'll move over to Jaime, who will do some of the same, but we'll incorporate all of that into a live demo on how to move lines and how districts are constructed. And I should just say that the little technical glitch we had right here, this is something that will become pretty normal for redistricting commissioners. We had technical issues pretty much in every location that we traveled to throughout the last redistricting, and patience is really something. And when people say patience is a virtue in redistricting, it definitely is a virtue. So, because you never know where you're going to end up and what your environment is going to be. So, taking a breath and just kind of going with it is really helpful. So let's go over the qualifications on which the candidates will be selected. There are analytical skills, which includes the ability to understand technical materials, including maps and statistical information. And this is not something that people usually really deal with. Not everybody deals with that. There's very few people that work with maps every day or work with statistics every day, at least not, complicated statistics. So it's something to get used to. They have to be able to resolve complex problems. The ability to be impartial includes the ability to evaluate information with an open mind and make decisions that set aside personal views and interests. Of course, my colleague Justin Levitt has told you a lot about this already, and I just need to reiterate that this is really something that will come in handy. To be able to be impartial, to really listen to people, to check your own beliefs, and if you come in with a really strong belief of what something should look like, but then you're being told by the public or by somebody that maybe you're not right, you have to be able to just step back and reevaluate that. And not everybody can do that, and hopefully you'll figure out a way to pick some applicants that are going to be able to do that, or at least are willing to try, because it's a hard thing. It's a very human thing. An appreciation for California's diverse demographics and geography. Understanding that California benefits from having effective participation by persons of all demographic characteristics, including race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, and so forth. Again, this is something that we've heard from Justin earlier, and it's something to keep in mind. We're an incredibly diverse state, and we're all going to be benefiting from people that really understand that and embrace it. It's very important to remember that you're not going to be looking for experts. If you were looking for experts, it would be slim pickings. You would not have 20,000 applications. There are not that many experts on redistricting, because redistricting is one of those niche-y things that only happens every 10 years, at least in most locations. And, to become a redistricting expert, you have to almost have a job like ours, where, we work on data, we talk to people, we figure out how to build redistricting data, we write papers, things like that, or like Justin, he teaches on the Voting Rights Act. That's what really makes you an expert. But not a lot of people are paid to do that kind of work. So that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for people that are willing to learn. People in this room are willing to learn, that are able to learn, that are able to look at numbers and kind of make sense of it, that are able to listen. Analytical skills is probably what I'm going to be talking about the most in this presentation. So successful applicants should be able to learn about the different data sets that I'm going to be presenting about, understand which data are used to measure or satisfy the various criteria, ask for clarification and explanations, receive input and be able to contextualize it, and recognizing that input is also data. So data don't just come from the census. In this context, data will come from people that present it to you. So that's called qualitative data, which doesn't mean that it's any more or less important than data that somebody will be presenting to you in a spreadsheet, for example. Weigh conflicting input and data. Not everybody's going to agree. If I ask, Jaime, where's your neighborhood? And then I ask her neighbor where the neighborhood is, they may just not be in agreement. Somebody may be a street off, or maybe a couple of streets off. Maybe there's a disagreement because somebody's lived there for a year, next person has lived there for 20 years. People's opinions about these things are different. So they have to weigh this and then figure out how to put this all together in these final maps. They have to also be able to analyze trade-offs and then make decisions. And this is also something that we'll talk about when we're looking at some more of these criteria and how they're actually implemented. I should say that some of the things that you're going to hear from me are things that Justin has already explained and has talked to you about in great detail. I may be talking about it a little bit differently. I find that that is actually very useful when people are learning about redistricting and redistricting criteria for the first time, because not everybody, understands information the first time, or in fact, in the way that it's presented. So sometimes it's good to hear from multiple people about the same topic. And also, I'm not a lawyer. So where do you start? This is where I always start. It doesn't really matter if you're doing a statewide redistricting or if you're doing a local redistricting. You figure out where your guidelines are. And the guidelines are in the California Constitution. And it can't hurt to read it once in a while if you are on a redistricting commission. So Section 2D says the commission shall establish single-member districts. This is something that Justin was also talking about. Remember the California Voting Rights Act that he mentioned? California Voting Rights Act does not necessarily apply to single-member districts that are, if there's no at-large elections. So single-member districts for the Senate, Assembly, Congress, and State Board of Equalization. So they know what they're going to do. They're going to be drawing for Senate, Assembly, Congress, and State Board of Equalization. So in the end, you want to have 4 statewide maps. Pursuant to a mapping process, okay, we need mapping software, using the following criteria as set forth in the following order of priority. This is important because in California, in the Constitution, the criteria are ranked. That makes it sometimes a little bit easier to draw lines than if everybody says, you know, here are all your criteria, now go figure it out. The California Constitution is a little bit more specific and says, here's the order of importance of these criteria. However, there's always a caveat. And the caveat in the California Constitution is criterion number 4. And we'll spend a little bit of time on that in a second. Criterion 1, equal population. So again, this is just the constitutional language. Districts shall comply with the United States Constitution, check. Congressional districts shall achieve population equality, so equal population, as nearly as practicable. And again, Justin has talked about what that means for congressional districts. Congressional districts have to be pretty equal. In fact, the last congressional districts that the current sitting CRC, Citizens Redistricting Commission, drew, they only varied by 1 person. Senatorial, Assembly, and State Board of Equalization districts shall have reasonably equal population. So you see that there's a little bit of a difference in the language there, and that is, of course, has to do with the laws and with cases that have been decided. So you do have a little bit more flexibility, and as Justin has said, if you have flexibility, that's a good thing. Flexibility means that you can maybe do a better job on some of the other criteria. Equal population, population equality is pretty much the single most constraint on a good redistricting plan. Just because if you're too narrow and you really want to be just down to 1 person, it becomes very, very difficult to meet the other criteria. You may have a city that's just like 10 people bigger. If you're saying we're gonna be just equal by one person, you're gonna be splitting cities, for example. We'll talk about that in a little bit also. So equal population with districts for the same office. So compared to the other districts within the assembly district, within the assembly district plan or the Senate plan, except where deviation is required to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act or allowable by law. So again, there is some flexibility, and generally, when you hear flexibility, I can't say it often enough, it's a good thing to allow yourself to have a little bit of flexibility. Consider that. There may be people coming in, and this is something that these applicants and the eventual commission will have to deal with. People will come in and make their opinion known about what they should be doing. They may be saying, you absolutely have to be very, very equal. If you deviate by more than 1 or 2%, you're gonna get sued. Well, that may not be true. So they have to be able to just listen to that and then weigh that, talk to their counsel, talk to their experts, and figure out what they want to do. Let's talk about data. Which data are used for the equal population criterion? We all know that the decennial census is upon us. Please tell everybody and your neighbors and everybody you know to fill out the form. We're very invested in that, especially in California. The file that we get from the decennial census is called the PL 94-171 file. PL stands for public law, and that is basically the redistricting data file. It's a census block level data set. It reports the total population and some other variables. And equal population, this goes to a question that somebody from the audience asked earlier, means you have to assign everyone to a district. So in California, that doesn't mean just people that you like, or just people, that are 18 and over, or citizens, or registered voters. Equal population means you assign everybody that was counted by the census. There's a tiny little bit of a caveat here, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's a very minor little caveat, and it has to do with the reallocation of the prison population. Not only citizens, voters, eligible voters, registered voters, but rather everyone who was counted by the census. Criterion 2 is the Federal Voting Rights Act. The Constitution says that districts shall comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Please note, just like Justin also pointed out, that there will likely be some confusion regarding the California Voting Rights Act, which does not in any way apply to statewide redistricting. So there are a lot of people right now that are very familiar with the California Voting Rights Act because a lot of jurisdictions have received a letter from an attorney that has asked them to convert from at-large to district elections. And this has really kind of appended a lot of the conversation on the local level about at-large versus district elections. A lot of jurisdictions have switched from at-large to districts. There are a lot of people in California that are very, very aware of the California Voting Rights Act. So I would not be surprised if there are people coming to testify at pretty much every meeting talking about the California Voting Rights Act rather than the Federal Voting Rights Act. So the commissioners, the eventual commission, need to be able to explain that and just let people know. And if it happens the 35th or the 38th time, just still explain it to everybody, because at every hearing there may be somebody different. And these people, they may not have been there before. They may not have been privy to information that's been shared before. So, some of this can become a little bit tedious after, your 50th hearing or so. You have to have patience. You have to be willing to just explain that, or at least have a good flyer and a handout out there that says, here, we've heard this. This is a frequently asked question. Here, take a look, and hopefully this will explain the situation. It'll definitely come up. Applicants should also have the analytical skills to be able to learn about the differences and explain this to the public. So they should know what the California Voting Rights Act does and then basically summarize it in their own words. Data necessary to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. So this is what gets a little bit more interesting in the data field. So there are really two parts to compliance. And again, Justin has talked about this, and I'm not going to talk about the Voting Rights Act for very long because there is just no way that I would be following Professor Justin Levitt with my, little short form of the Voting Rights Act. So you're going to get 3 slides on this, and I'm just going to tell you about the data. And maybe I can audit your class that had like 1-2 semester class sometime. Thank you. So measuring, analyzing is the first piece. And what that looks like is you or the commission, they will hire experts or one expert. And hopefully they'll hire that expert pretty early because otherwise all the experts are going to be busy. And the expert would conduct a racially polarized voting analysis. And that is a pretty complex analysis. And again, the commissioners, the eventual commissioners, do not have to do that themselves. In fact, you probably would not want them to do it themselves unless you have somebody on that commission, and even then, who actually knows how to do it, because there's a lot to it. There's few people who know how to do it, but there's different types of data that you need to conduct it, and Justin has, again, already talked about it. Applicants must be able to work with their expert and the council to make decisions about majority-minority districts. When you have an expert and they are conducting a racially polarized voting analysis, it doesn't mean that at the very end they're going to say, okay, you must do X. There is some flexibility. It's a collaboration with the commissioners, the council, the expert to figure out whether or not that particular district must be drawn and should be drawn. So these decisions need to be made with the council and with the expert. And what we need is people that are willing to work with the council and with the expert, and probably with the line drawers also, to make sure that these districts, if they have to be implemented, are implemented, and that they are implemented well. there are definitely going to be some data sets, some statistics, and some graphics that they're going to be presented with that are not necessarily easy to understand. But patience, again, is a virtue. Wanting to learn and being open to learn and really listening to them is going to be a really good thing. Then the second part to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act is drawing the district. Applicants must be able to work with their redistricting consultant to construct districts that comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And again, there is not usually one way to do this. Sometimes there's multiple ways to do it. If you're thinking about Los Angeles, and if you ever have the time to look at the maps that the currently sitting Citizens Redistricting Commission drew and really struggled with in Los Angeles, you'll see how many different ways there may be to really get to Rome, so to speak. There are many protected communities that are living in the same place. And with Section 2 or Federal Voting Rights Act districts, you have to get to 50% plus citizen voting age population. And the question is, which voting age population am I looking at? Are you looking at multiple minorities? Are you looking at a single minority? This is a very complex task, and you need to be able to work with all of your staff and your consultants to be able to get this right. So this also goes to, something else that Professor Levitt pointed out, which is the people you're selecting, the people that are in the pool, they should be able to make some good decisions about hiring and really, communicate with the consulting applicants and the Voting Rights Council applicants and so forth to make sure that there's a good fit, that these are people that really want to communicate with them, and that you don't end up with somebody who's just going to look at, these commissioners and say, well, you guys are not the expert. I'm the expert. I'm going to tell you what to do. I don't think that that is what you really want. You want somebody who can really collaborate with them and hire people that will bring them up to speed and treat them like equals. So the data that are used to do Federal Voting Rights Act analyses and then later draw are census data, data from the American Community Survey, and that particularly is one variable, and that is citizen voting age population. Citizen voting age population, that is pretty much the variable that we've all been arguing about of whether or not it goes onto the decennial census or not. So we just had a ruling, of course, that said it's not going to go onto the census. It is still, however, collected in a different survey. We'll talk about that in a second. So that is the one variable from this particular survey that is necessary. Then there's voter registration data. There is statement of vote data. And then, of course, there's geography. Everything that we're talking about has an underlying geography, and that is how you're putting all these puzzle pieces together. I put a little note in there because sometimes when people see voter registration and statement of vote, they're like, hey, this is not supposed to be a political process. Well, just because you need these data to do a racially polarized voting analysis does not mean that you have all of a sudden, entered into the political realm. You have to look at participation of minority populations, and you have to look at an effectiveness of a district and so forth. So not just having political data available does not mean that they should or will be used for political purposes. These data are necessary for compliance of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Actually, let me stop right here and just see if there's a quick question. Anybody? Because I see some people making notes, so if there's any notes that have questions, please. And if not, I'll just keep going. Good. Thank you. So criterion 3, contiguity and data used. So this is the brief one in the Constitution. District shall be geographically contiguous. It's a geographic criterion, as the sentence suggests. And the data you use for that are census geography. The geographic integrity, this is criterion 4, so this is a good one, because this is the one. All of the criteria are ranked, as I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And criterion 4 has some surprises for us, because within this criterion, all these different things are not ranked. They're all on the same level. So It goes, the geographic integrity of any city and county, local neighborhood, or local community of interest shall be respected in a manner that minimizes their division to the extent possible without violating the requirements of any of the preceding subdivisions. A community of interest is a contiguous population, i.e. contiguous together, which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. Okay, it's a long criterion. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at cities and counties, which of course really there's only one city and county in the state of California, I think, which is San Francisco. Local neighborhood and local community of interest. None of these, just because it says city and county first, does not mean that they're more or less important than local communities of interest or local neighborhoods. So what does that mean for your panelists or for the people that you're going to be selecting? What it means is that they're going to have to be able to weigh these different factors here and figure out how to put them all together. So some things are not going to be clear, they're not going to be ambiguous. I could not agree more with Justin about how, you really need somebody who can be comfortable with some ambiguity, because this is a little ambiguous. So this is not really clear cut. We have pretty much clear marching orders until then, but not here. So this also means that, and we'll talk about this in a second, that you need to actually talk to people. The first set of criteria, you don't necessarily have to talk to people. With these here, you will, you have to talk to people. This was the pointer right here. Okay. So, and here's why. Cities and counties, you have census geography. Census geography is available through the statewide database from the census, and you know where the city and county boundaries are, because those are pretty defined. Neighborhoods, not so clear necessarily. Justin mentioned Los Angeles, where he lives. They have set neighborhoods. I bet you could find some people in LA that don't agree with those neighborhood boundaries. I almost bet you. There are some cities where the city government has delineated neighborhood boundaries, and if you go to the neighborhood and you talk to people, they're like, that's the city. Our neighborhood is actually someplace completely different. It's smaller, it's bigger. Usually it's smaller. Sometimes neighborhoods come out of planning areas, maybe redevelopment areas, so forth. Sometimes neighborhoods are defined by realtors. And if they are, then sometimes those boundaries change a little bit. Example, San Francisco. I used to live in the Mission in San Francisco. And that same house now is in Noe Valley, apparently, and it was not moved. So again, because these data can be a little ambiguous and they are not necessarily readily available, there's going to have to be a dialogue, basically. Commissioners going out and saying, okay, what do we do here? What do we know about this particular jurisdiction? We have these cities. Do we know something about neighborhoods? Can somebody give us information? Talk to their consultants. People will come to them if they give an opportunity for people to come to them, and they will inform them about this. They will say, I live in this city. We have neighborhoods. Here's where you can get them. Sometimes they can get them. Sometimes they won't be able to get them. Sometimes they maybe don't need them. If there is a city that does not need to be split, that's going to be comfortably nested in the middle of a Board of Equalization district, let's say, because they're really big, maybe they won't need to know about every single neighborhood or about every single community of interest. But for some cities, you may need to know about where they are and where communities of interest are. And that is where that dialogue with the public really comes in. Communities of interest, my absolute favorite criterion, definitely not readily available. How do you get it? You talk to the public again. Public testimony, data or geography submitted by the public, by local officials, etc. Sometimes it can be supplemented with other data. I know there was at least one group in California during the last redistricting that did a lot of work with American Community Survey data, and they would supplement that just because they thought, maybe if we have some statistics, then people are more likely to believe the members of the public that are testifying to this. It's a nice gesture. I don't think you need it. So finally, not finally, almost finally, criterion 5, compactness and then data used for compactness. The Constitution reads, to the extent practicable, and where this does not conflict with the criteria above, districts shall be drawn to encourage geographical compactness such that nearby areas of population are not bypassed for more distant population. So this is something, of course, that Justin talked about at length. I could not agree with him more. This is a very misunderstood criterion. If you're talking to people on the local level, you may be explaining it differently than on the state level, because on the local level, compactness may not have the same definition as it does on the state level, but we have a definition. Again, it's a geographic criterion. We're using census geography for this. And then finally, criterion 6, nesting in the data used to the extent practicable, and where this does not conflict with the criteria above, each Senate district shall be comprised of 2 whole, complete, and adjacent assembly districts, and each Board of Equalization district shall be comprised of 10 whole, complete, and adjacent Senate districts. And the data used are the newly created districts, so you can't even start thinking about this until you have some districts. And there's 2 ways to do this. Actually, you could either draw the Senate first and then split it, or you could do the Assembly first and then combine them. There's 2 ways to roam. There's been some research done on the effects of that. I can tell you about that in a second. The currently sitting redistricting commission decided to draw some good assembly districts first, and then they looked at whether or not they would be able to nest them. So let's summarize the data that we just heard about that we need for the different criteria. So for equal population, our first criterion, we need data from the decennial census, in particular the PL 94-171 file, which is really the only file you're getting from the decennial census. Second is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. You need, again, decennial census PL 94-171 data, statement of registration, statement of vote, citizen voting age population from the American Community Survey, which is usually referred to as the ACS, contiguity, census geography, respect for city and county boundaries, census geography, respect for neighborhoods, public testimony, data, geography submitted by the public by cities and counties, respect for communities of interest, same thing, public testimony, data, geography submitted by the public, perhaps supplemented with American Community Survey data or some other data that people may have that may show that there is a particular community of interest. Compactness, census geography, and nesting the newly created districts. Let me stop right here for a second. We're going to go through all of these in a little bit more detail. So this was kind of your big overview. Are there any questions right now, or would you like to wait a little bit and see if I'll explain it going forth? Good? Okay. Okay, the census. The census that everybody will be filling out in the state of California. Conducted every 10 years since 1790. It determines the number of people living in the United States. Their motto is, count people once, only once, and in the right place. It's the only count of the population. This is something to keep in mind. This is the only time we actually count people. What the census also does with the American Community Survey and so forth is they have a lot of surveys out. And these are all samples, and they result in estimates of the population. But for redistricting, you're supposed to use the count of the population. And that is what the decennial census will give you. It provides a snapshot of the US population. Why is it called a snapshot? Because it's taken on one day. April 1 of the year ending with 0 is census day. So that's the snapshot of the population. It collects data from every household and more. And I put and more there because we, of course, have a pretty large unhoused population in some areas in California. So those are not people that live in households at this point, but there's also a census effort that attempts to count everybody who may not have a home to live in at the moment. And so it's not just households, even though people always talk about households. So it's more. It was previously known as the short form for those of us that have been around for a little bit longer. There used to also be a long form. That's now called the American Community Survey. And Census Day, again, is April 1, 2020. What does the census ask everybody? There's some basic questions. They include name, age, race, Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin, sex, relationship, owner-renter, and it will not ask a citizenship question. Again, that citizenship question is on the American Community Survey, which is an estimate. It's a sample survey. Talk about it in a second. The relationship is the relationship to the person that is filling out the form. So it's not asking like, are you single or are you on a dating website or something, okay? Okay, census data, also known as the PL 94-171, and this is actually how redistricting people talk about this. They don't talk about census data. They're like, hey, Justin, you got the PL or the PL 94 handy? And he'll go, sure, it's right here on his flash drive. And that's probably exactly what he does have on the flash drive. So what's the mission of the PL 94-171? It is to provide the officers or public bodies having initial responsibility for the legislative apportionment of or districting of each state an opportunity to identify the geographic areas for which specific tabulations of population are desired and to deliver those tabulations in a timely manner. Only the census could draft something like that. So it means that the census will give the local jurisdictions the data that they need to draw districts. That's what all of that means. We identified the geographic areas desired on which we would like to get our census data as the census tabulation blocks or census blocks. So that's census geography. And that's a smaller unit of analysis that the census delivers data on. The requirements for the census are that the program is conducted in a nonpartisan manner. They have to deliver the tabulations, so basically the collected data, to the governor and the officers or public bodies having initial responsibility for the legislative apportionment or districting of each state no longer than 1 year from Census Day, which is April 1, 2021. That's 1 year from Census Day. That doesn't mean we're going to get it the last day of March or middle of March. We actually don't really know when we're going to get it. Like Justin, I'm hoping that we're going to get it a little bit earlier because they have a lot to do. The census has a lot to do. They have changed the way that they're processing data, and they're applying some confidentiality rules to the data this time, which means that they have to pretty much process everybody in the United States at the same time. They used to go one state at a time, and that would mean that the smaller states would come out first, and then the larger states, of course, you go like, okay, I have all these states. Let's get the first like really little ones out so it looks better and we feel better. We got something done. But I think actually that all the states are going to be released pretty close together. And I am also hoping that they're going to have data out maybe by the end of February or definitely early March. So that we can all get to work, especially us actually first at the state by database. So what's in the PL 94-171 database, data file? The final prototype design, so the census always releases prototypes because they're not sure whether something is, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. For the census this time, that's definitely true because until, 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we were still thinking, okay, are we getting a citizenship question or not? So they definitely have like prototype files. The final 2018 had these particular layouts, and this is also something that the new commissioners and the applicant pool needs to be able to become familiar with and not just shy away from, when people are talking about tables with table numbers and things like that. I mean, I have a lot of friends who will just go, okay, done with this conversation, let's move on to something else. But it's not that hard. It's just a lot of it is just terminology, really. Table 1 has race. Table 2, race for the population 18 years and over, which you will all of course, recognized as voting age population. Table 3, Hispanic, Latino, and not Hispanic and Latino by race. Table 4, Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race for population 18 and over. And then we have occupancy status, which is housing, which is are you renter, owner, and so forth. And then we have something new this time. And this is the group quarters file. It's actually pretty exciting, and it has to do with the reallocation of the prisoner data. I'll talk about it a little bit, and Justin, of course, has talked about it earlier already. California will actually be adjusting the census, and that may take a little bit longer than just a day or two, but we'll see how quickly we can do it. The group quarters table only includes the total population. It does not have a breakdown by race or ethnicity or any demographics. So the American Community Survey, also known as the ACS, replaced the long form. Some of you, has anybody in this room ever received a long form? Some of you are not old enough to ever have received a long form, but I actually received a long form in 2000. Was one of the more exciting days of my life. So people used to get either, a short form with just maybe 10 or so questions on it, and the long form asks absolutely pretty much everything. How long does it take you to, go to work? And, how do you live? All of these, housing costs. Do you rent? How much do you pay for your rent? Are you a homeowner? How much is your mortgage? And so forth. That was replaced in 2005. And part of the reason was that the census is they're trying to become more efficient as a whole. And they're trying to also be more responsive to the state's needs to give them data that they need that are maybe not 10 years outdated, because the long form was only out every 10 years. So the ACS is conducted monthly. So they're out interviewing millions of people every year. So I think monthly it's about 300,000 households that they're interviewing. So these data can be updated a little bit more, and they're fresher, as we say. The data are released yearly, though, and it's what we call a range data set. So it's not the snapshot. It's not like this is what happened on that one day that we have on the short form and in the PL94. In the American Community Survey, we have data from a few years, usually, that are summarized. And it's pretty interesting what that means sometimes, but let's go through this really quickly. Collected data include educational attainment, income, housing costs, disability status, employment, and more. It collects data on citizenship, and then it releases citizen voting age population, which is what you need to figure out whether or not you can draw a Federal Voting Rights Act district, because in order to have one, you have to have 50% or more of citizen voting age population. And you're getting this right here. So here's what's interesting think about when you're collecting data over time. So you have this data set that was collected over 5 years, right? So let's say I was asked 5 years ago, and then Jaime is asked this year. Well, I didn't age in that. It's kind of great, actually. I didn't age in that data set, right? So I'm still the same age that I was 5 years ago. So that also means that people maybe don't turn 18 as quickly as they should turn 18, right? So if you have like a 16-year-old who was surveyed 5 years ago, and then the data come out next year, well, that person's still 16 in the survey. So there are some shortcomings there. And if you're looking at, traditionally perhaps younger populations, say Latino populations have more kids, maybe a younger population overall, citizen voting age population may kind of understate a little bit about how many people are voting age. So citizen voting age population may be a little bit affected. That's the nitty-gritty, and that's something that they also have to understand. The people that you're selecting, they have to be able to kind of look at these data and then figure this out. But again, they don't have to be experts, because they will have experts available that can explain this to them. It's just a matter of keeping it in mind. And when they're starting to look at drawing, Section 2 compliant Federal Voting Rights Act districts, they should be able to remember this and then ask questions. A little bit more about the ACS. As I mentioned, the ACS is not the count of the population. So we don't draw lines really with it. We use it for other purposes. It produces estimates that are comparable for geographies recognized by the Census Bureau. This is not considered to be a snapshot. It's considered a portrait of the population. It's a little bit wider. The 5-year ACS estimates are released yearly for small geographies. The 3-year and 1-year estimates are released for larger geographies. So some of these, what this means is just that they're not available for these larger geographies. They may be available like on the city level or so, because statistically it's very difficult to release something that you're collecting for the entire United States for a small geography of, say, California, and have it actually be good data. ACS data are not released on the census block level. And that's important for us to understand, because when we're building districts, we're actually using census blocks. Here's a little graphic that will show you the different census geographies. So census blocks are very much at the bottom here. This is a smaller unit of analysis. Excuse me. And you'll see all of this when Jaime, you're doing something with blocks, I'm sure. So Jaime is going to show something about how blocks are put together and how they end up in districts. But what you see here also is that blocks nest in block groups. They nest in census tracts, in counties, in states, and then in the nation. So they're not split. But this is the unit of analysis that we get data from the decennial census. So from the short form, from the PL94, your total population data and something about race and ethnicity and voting age population is available on the census block. Here's what this looks like visually. I figured you all need a map by now. So here's a little graphic. These very tiny little guys here, those are census blocks. Then you see this purple line here, this purple dotted line. These are block groups. So a number of different blocks make up block groups. And the reason for why I'm showing this to you is because when you're talking American Community Survey, you can get data on the block group level, but not on the very tiny small level. But you may want data on the tiny little small level, and that will present you with a problem. What's bigger here is a census tract, and this is something that people are going to be talking to you about. This is probably one of the things when you're talking about census data that most people get confused. And in particular, members of the public will come in and they'll talk about how, districts are drawn with census tracts or with block groups, because it's just all a little fuzzy. I mean, why would anybody know this, right? There's no reason for anybody who doesn't work with these data to know this. Again, what helps, I think, is to make sure you have really good handouts, really good frequently asked questions, and a commission that is open to hearing the same question 8 times and then saying, okay, staff, we've heard this 8 times now. If it's not in the frequently asked questions yet, let's put it there so that people can actually learn, so we can bring everybody up to speed, so we can all have an interactive and good conversation about how this should all work and what it should all look like. Just a little census geography by the numbers so you can see how many of these units of analysis we actually have for California. Of course, we have 58 counties. That's not going to change. But in 2010, we had 8,057 census tracts in California. We had 23,212 census block groups and a whopping 144 census blocks in California. And again, you're drawing districts using census blocks. So that's a lot of clicking around. Of course, Jaime is going to show you how you don't have to click 710,000 census blocks to draw districts, but still, it's a lot of very finely grained data. People need to be able to become comfortable with this. Should we stop for questions or just to see? Yes, please.
Redistricting lines, they can never go through a census block.
If you ask me, yes, that is true. Because if you split a census block, you're never going to know exactly what your total population is, because it's the lowest unit of analysis on which you get information. The census will tell you on this block, there's 100 people live in this block, but they're not going to tell you that there's 50 people on one side of the block and 50 people on the other side of the block. So especially for congressional districts where you have to be within one person, I would never advocate splitting a census block. I mean, I would not advocate splitting a census block, period.
Mhm. Because it's a problem with the data analysis, not necessarily it's legally impermissible to split a census block.
So again, I am not an attorney.
Okay.
I would say that if you don't know what your total population is for the district, it would make me personally very uncomfortable if I can't answer that question. And if you split a census block, that's where you're going to be. You will never know what your population is.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the panel members? From the public?
And thank you for that question. That's actually a really good question. So I'll keep going, and maybe there will be other questions later. Don't be shy. Okay, election data. So why do we need election data? Again, just because you have them doesn't mean you're automatically going to draw partisan maps. They are necessary for Federal Voting Rights Act assessment and compliance. They're used along with the PL 94, which we now know is short form data, and the American Community Survey. They consist of two data sets, roughly speaking, which is Statement of Registration and Statement of the Vote. They are collected by registrars of voters and the Secretary of State. The Statement of Registration is an individual level data set, which means that there is information in it for each registered voter, and that data set resides with the Secretary of State ultimately. And the Statement of Vote is a precinct level data set. So that means that all of the results, everything that's in it, are reported on the precinct level. So that's election precinct level. Let's talk about geographies really quickly, and I'll go back to something here in a second. The data sets that we have discussed are released on different geography, as you just heard, different geographies. So, oops. We have census blocks, which are the smallest unit of analysis, so the smallest geography. Then we have census block groups and tracts from the American Community Survey. Then we have election precincts on which we get voter information. Census geography is maintained by the Census Bureau, and it stays constant for 10 years. So it stays constant between the censuses. Precinct geography is maintained by 58 registrars of voters, because we have 58 counties in the state of California. And what are they? They are really organizing units to conduct elections and then release the results. They change frequently, often with each election. And guess what? The census and the registrars, they don't talk to each other. Those are completely different data sets. They serve completely different purposes. But now here we are, and we need to figure out how to get all of this to work together in a redistricting, because we need all of these different data. Let's look at what this looks like in practice. This is a census block boundary right here. These little like dotted red lines, those are census blocks. And here, this purple thing, this is a precinct boundary. So you see that they are not corresponding at all. They have really nothing to do with each other. So if you're getting data from here in the precinct, and then you're getting lots of data over here in these small units, you don't really know how they all fit together if you wanted to put them together. Here we have an example of a census block that is split among 3 districts. So the red thing is a census block, and then these lines here are all the different precincts. These are actual precincts in California. So there's really no communication, or very little. I should say that there's some registrars of voters that are trying to move their precincts to the census block boundaries, because that would enable them to actually get some demographic data, and it would really be helpful. But that's not always possible, because we have so many different districts in the state of California that are also drawn for different purposes. You know, we have water districts and transportation districts and mortuary districts and mosquito abatement districts and city council districts and supervisor districts and all that. So, you know, you never know who draws them, how they draw them, and they may be going all over the place. So that's kind of the problem here. So this gets us to the solution. What is a redistricting database? A redistricting database solves the problem of conflicting and frequently changing geographies. That's what it does. It contains various data sets, the data sets we have so far talked about, and it merges them and releases them on the census block level. So basically everything gets put onto the census block, because that's our one stable unit, at least for 10 years. So we can then use that and draw districts with it. Typically, redistricting databases contain census data, some data from the American Community Survey, statement of vote data, and statement of registration data. For California, Government Code Section 8253 says, the legislature shall take steps necessary to ensure that a complete and accurate computerized database is available for redistricting, and that procedures are in place to provide the public ready access to redistricting data. That function is provided by the statewide database, which is where Jaime and I work down at Berkeley. And there's a reason for why it's provided by an entity that's at Berkeley, because the legislature had a bipartisan agreement to move it out of a political environment and move it into a neutral environment. So we're at a university, and it's a completely public data set that is run in a nonpartisan way. The statewide database is the redistricting database for the state of California. It's part of Berkeley law on the UC Berkeley campus. It's what's called a longitudinal data set. Goes back to 1992. That just means that there are a lot of different elections all the way back to 1992 that can be downloaded and assessed together with census data and so forth. It's public, nonpartisan, and free of charge. It's available in different formats, and we provide data and geography for the entire state of California. This has really come in handy for a lot of the local jurisdictions that are now dealing with the California Voting Rights Act, because all of a sudden they all needed redistricting data also. So we've actually become more popular than we ever thought possible, in particular between, state redistrictings, because usually it's not all that busy, to tell you the truth. Between the years of like ending with 2 and 8 maybe, but not this time. It's been plenty busy. Our data, by that I don't mean just statewide database data. These are really our data. These are Californians' data. These are data that are paid with taxpayers' funds. So they're, available to everybody. These are our data. They start with the census. Oops, again, the wrong button. I'm very sorry. Again, here's the census, the PL 94-171 file, statement of vote from statewide elections. So one note, we have not, up until now, we haven't had funding to process the local elections. So we have statewide elections because we were really designed to be the statewide data set for statewide redistricting. Statement of registration, also from statewide elections. We process one variable from the American Community Survey, which, as I've pointed out earlier, has a lot of variables, including plumbing, by the way, my favorite. And precinct data and geography. We are the only place in the state of California that has precinct lines from whenever, you name it. If it was a statewide election, we have the precinct info. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes the registrars of voters come back to us and say, hey, do you guys have the precinct file from like 3-4 years ago? And then we give it back to them. So we're the only entity that actually collects that. And it really comes in handy when you're doing racially polarized voting analyses, because you need to know where those precincts were. And each year ending with 1, we create a redistricting data set that contains the new census data and then multiple elections on the census block level. So everything that we've collected throughout the decade, and then actually even further back, we merge together and we make available as a redistricting data set. And that is a block level data set. So all of these variables are on the census block level. Any questions right now?
Any from the panel members? Nope. So please, yeah, and come to the microphone and state your name.
I'm Daniel Quincy. So the precincts are smaller than the census blocks. No?
Bigger.
They're bigger? Always?
Yeah.
Because my question was going to be, you really don't want to split a precinct, because then you have lots of questions about the voting stuff. And so, don't you, I mean, there's a hierarchy of information there. Is it okay to split a precinct?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. So I think if I hear you correctly, you're wondering about precincts versus census geography and basically what trumps what. So usually first you have the district, and then once all the districts are there, the registrars re-precinct. They actually re-precinct a lot, so they change their precinct boundaries a lot. So maintaining a precinct when you're building a data set is not necessarily something that you need to do, because by the time you've maintained it and you've released your data, that precinct has already changed. So what you just want is you want to make sure that you have a the geographic location of the precinct, so you know where it was, so that you can pull in the underlying demographic data and then merge it together with the voting results and the registration data. So basically the precinct will then change, but your underlying geography, the census geography, will stay the same. Otherwise you would never be able to look at something over time. You would be hopping around because the precinct is constantly changing. And in some jurisdictions in California, it changes frequently. So there is always a question that comes up that says, okay, when you're redistricting, make sure you look at the precincts and don't split the precincts and don't create a lot of work for the registrars of voters. That is part of their work, is when they get new lines, they have to re-precinct, because that's just the way it is. That's just part of their job. I hope that made sense. Are there any more questions?
Seeing none, proceed.
Okay, cool. We'll move on. And please let me know if you want to have a break. We've been on for an hour.
Yeah, we'll go to still got about 20 minutes.
Okay, good. Great. Okay, we'll go on. Equal population. Let's go back to this because we've learned a lot about census data. Just a couple of slides here to give you a little bit of a flashback to what happened in the last redistricting. This is a slide that shows the total deviation that we had and the total deviation ranges that we had on for the different district levels. So this also shows you the reason for why you want to use a very, very small unit of analysis, especially when you're looking at this congressional thing here. The total deviation, meaning how much did the districts vary from each other, was 2 people. These are people. In the Senate, there were 18,000 and something people off. In the Assembly, 9,000 people. And Board of Equalization, of course, that's a huge, huge area that you're covering. It was a lot more. But over here in percent, the deviation for the Assembly was 1.98%. And for the Senate, the same. And then for Congress, it's pretty much 0. This is something that Justin was talking about also. There's a real constraint here that was self-imposed by the commission. They wanted to stay below 2% if they could. And it sometimes made it very tricky for them. For Congress, of course, somebody else has already imposed that constraint on you, because we have case law that says that congressional districts are held to strict scrutiny on the population rule, and they have to be very equal in population. But if any of you were around during the last redistricting when the commission was trying to equalize the congressional districts, here's what you would have seen. You would have seen a redistricting commission sitting in a hearing room, a big screen that had census blocks and the population of all the census blocks on the map, and members of the public, and everybody had pointers, and everybody was looking at census blocks that had just the right population so we could equalize these districts to 1 or 2 people. I was like, I found one. This one has 3 people. Will this work? Oh no, it's going the wrong way. It was this back and forth, and it was quite entertaining, I have to say. But what it illustrated was how incredibly difficult and constraining this can be. You know, and if there was a community of interest there, well, that was tough luck, you know, because equal population is a higher ranked criterion, and they did not really have the flexibility to do something else. On the other districts, they did have a little bit of flexibility. And as Justin said, sometimes it's a good thing to just take advantage of the fact that you have flexibility and just use it, because you may be able to do a better job with some of the other criteria. Maybe you can keep a city together because you're allowing for a little bit more deviation, or maybe a community of interest. Here's a little map for you, and this also kind of illustrates some of the data that we talked about. We talked about the Federal Voting Rights Act, and I've mentioned that you need, 50% plus citizen voting age population when you're drawing this. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but this is LA, and these are all the districts that had 50% plus voting age population. And this was also from the last redistricting. That doesn't necessarily mean that these are all districts that had to be drawn under Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, but it definitely means that you have to look at them a little bit closer and then, figure out what do you need to do here. Voting Rights Council in the room, expert in the room, racially polarized voting analysis, use those data you have access to, and figure this out. So you see that there's a lot of them here, and this is just LA. Imagine the entire state. It gets interesting very, very quickly. Here's a little caveat that I was talking about earlier about the PL94, which people are going to, usually refer to as the redistricting data set from the census. Well, that is true, but it only has one level of data in it, right? It just has the population data and so forth in it. It doesn't have the additions that we talked about. There were two bills in the Assembly. One was in 2011. That was Assembly Bill 420, the Davis bill. And then very recently, last year, AB 2172, the Weber bill, which implemented some technical changes to the Davis bill. I'll tell you what this is about. It requires the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, to provide a data set to the Citizens Redistricting Commission, CRC, and the legislature between April 1, 2020 and July 1, 2020 regarding the last known place of residence of each inmate in a facility under the control of the CDCR on April 1, 2020. You recognize that date, that's Census Day. So we want to know who is in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation on Census Day. Why? Because on Census Day is when the census takes its snapshot. We want to know the snapshot in the CDCR for that day. Why? Because CDCR has to provide the information about the ethnicity also, as identified by the inmate, and any information about the race of the inmate to the extent such information is maintained by the CDCR, and they have to provide that because California has to adjust its census data. It requires the legislature in coordination with the CRC to ensure that the information provided by the CDCR is included in the computerized database that is used for redistricting, i.e. the statewide database. So what do we have to do at statewide database? We have to take the information, we have to work with CDCR to get the info in a file that we can read and all that, and then adjust the census data, work with the California Redistricting Commission to make sure we all know what we're doing. And then it requests the CRC, the California Redistricting Commission, to deem each incarcerated person as residing at his or her most recent residential address, rather than at the institution of his or her incarceration. So what does the bill do? It asks that the CRC please not use the population as reported by the census in the institutions, but rather use the reallocated data. We take the inmate population out where they are right now, out of the census block, and we put them where they used to live, okay? So many come out of one place and few go into many different locations. So that is something that we have to do at the statewide database. And that is ultimately going to be part of the official statewide database and the redistricting database for the state of California. I'm pointing this out because the census still has the PL94 on their website. And people will have computer programs, and those computer programs, they charge people a lot of money to import census information. So they paid a little extra, and then they're going to have a census data set that is actually different from the census data set that California is going to be using. The commission will have to understand that. They will have to understand why people come in, and they're going to say, you said that district has 500 people, and I'm telling you that district has 490 people. And why is that? Well, that is probably because 10 people were part of this whole reallocation procedure, and because of that, the totals are wrong. So the question is going to be, where did you get your data? They have to understand how this all works, and that takes a little bit of learning, takes some patience, definitely will take a frequently asked question and maybe a suggestion to download the data so everybody can work with the same data set. This all goes into analytical skills. Just being able to learn, being able to communicate, being able to explain, having the patience to just sit through and really understand all of this. There's a lot of detail in this. But, they are going to have staff and they are going to have consultants. So asking questions when they need to is also a really good thing. Nobody is expecting anybody to understand and learn all of this overnight. I mean, I've been at this for a long time and I just learned a ton of stuff from Justin today. And I have listened to a lot of these kinds of presentations. You just don't stop learning, but not being afraid to ask and not being afraid to just, maybe just check your belief system and reevaluate what you think is a really good thing in this process. Again, what I just explained was that California will be adjusting the data it receives from the census, i.e., in other words, the PL94 total population race and ethnicity counts will be adjusted, such that inmates under the control of the CDRC on census day that are in group quarters are reallocated to their last known residential address. And you may remember that slide where I said there's going to be one additional file on the PL94, that's the group quarter file. And that is why the census is giving us a group quarter file, because it didn't used to be on that data set. It is on there now because, as we talked about earlier, there are more and more states that actually want the prisoners not to be counted in the prisons, but rather in their last known address. Because it makes a difference especially on local redistricting. I mean, if you have let's say you have a local city that has 1,000 residents and 500 of those are in an institution, and then you take them out, that's going to make a difference. But those 500, they may not be participating, you may not be representing them. This makes actually a really big difference. We're also looking at the impact of this on the local level now. So there's another bill that's making its way through the legislature right now about this. The Citizen Redistricting Commission must consider whether to use the adjusted data set. So we're not telling them they have to, but we're asking, or the legislature is asking them to consider it. So in order to make that decision, of course, they're going to have to understand what the differences are and what the impacts are. Oh, again, the CRC must be able to explain to the public also why the redistricting data for California are slightly different from the PL94-171 data as released by the census. And again, this is one of those things, these days everybody can download a lot of things, and people are downloading, they may be working with another data set, and just being really upfront about this. This is where the data are. Please, if you want to work with us, use the same data set so we're all communicating on the same level. It's definitely something that a successful applicant would be, it would be good if they had that ability and those capabilities. So to summarize, applicants for the Redistricting Commission should possess the analytical skills to learn about the different data sets that are part of a redistricting database, understand why redistricting data sets are built on the census block level, make decisions about the adjusted data set, and explain to the public why the data they may be using as part of a privately owned software package may differ from the official redistricting data set. We can't control all of the software packages that are out there. There's so many of them out there. And, we just need to be able to explain to people that that's what they should be doing. Let's go to criterion number 3. This is contiguity. Sounds pretty straightforward. Nothing really is all that straightforward in this process. District shall be geographically contiguous. And the definition is a district in which all parts are connected to each other, or in other words, a district in which one may travel from any location to any other location without crossing the district boundary. That's at least the summary kind of over the thumb definition. There are always exceptions to the rule. Census geography is used to meet this criterion. Well, let's take a look. Okay, here is your first exception to that. So how are you going to get, this is one district, this one here and this one here. These are in one district. Why is that? Because there are people in California that are living on islands. You can't just not allocate them. You have to allocate everything that's part of California to a district. So They're also not big enough to get their own district. Definitely not. They're probably not big enough to get their own city council district. So they need to be allocated to some district. And the Citizens Redistricting Commission, the currently sitting one, they made that decision to include this island here with this particular district. So you can call it the island contiguity. Contiguity, you can write books about it. There's all these differences and all these like different variations. We have some good examples here in California, which is kind of fun to show, and some nice maps here. So here's another one, a very pretty one. This is down in San Diego and has a bridge right there. So this is actually bridge contiguity. So you have this district that goes all the way up there. And I know it looks a little funny, but what we learned from Justin earlier is that we don't want to assume anything here. We want to ask questions, because compactness, which we'll talk about later, does not mean that it can't look like this. Just because we think compactness should be, a little box or a circle or so, that actually does not apply in California. We need to ask questions. We need to know where populations are located. And over here, of course, we have a little bridge that connects Coronado to the rest of the district. And then here I have an island and a bridge map. So this is city and county of San Francisco. And this here is Treasure Island. And this is the Bay Bridge. And of course, Treasure Island, you're supposed to keep cities together, right? And cities and counties together. So we try to do that. Well, Treasure Island definitely belongs to San Francisco, and it's connected with the bridge, and it was assigned to a part of San Francisco. And what happened here is that the total population of all of San Francisco was too large to put it into just one district, so it had to be split someplace. And people had a good conversation about where all of these lines should go. This is again something that the commissioners will have to do, because they will know from the census data and from the data that we're providing at Statewide Database that they can't put the entire city and county of San Francisco into just one assembly district. So they have to split someplace. But where do we split? Well, that's where we go to neighborhoods, communities of interest, and we ask people. Criterion 4, the exciting one, local jurisdictions and communities. So data on county and city boundaries are part of the statewide database, but data on communities of interest are not. Neighborhood data and boundaries, they're not necessarily readily available. They may be for some cities, but they generally need to be collected still. They're not part of the data set. They will largely rely on public testimony, data and geography submitted by the public and cities, sometimes, etc. Communities of interest, again, they're not readily available and definitely need to be collected. Public testimony, data, geography submitted by the public, local officials, and other data sources can be used for that. And by other data sources, I mean, people may just have constructed a data set, or it may just be American Community Survey data. We've seen quite a few different data sets that people brought in, but usually along with community members that said, we are a community of interest, and here are some statistics that prove it. I think they would have probably been fine just saying, we're a community and this is why we're a community. But, sometimes people feel better if they also just have something that they can hand to somebody that says, and here are the statistics. Neighborhoods, communities, and public input. Government Code Section 8253 also says, the Commission shall establish and implement an open hearing process for public input and deliberation that shall be subject to public notice and promoted through a thorough outreach program to solicit broad public participation in the redistricting public review process. So I think the last CRC, they read that as, we need to go out there and talk to people, do a really good process. And this is the point where you need to find applicants that are willing to do that are willing to travel. The last Citizens Redistricting Commission, they had a lot of hearings. They went on the road show. They were all over California, and I know you're going to hear from them in the next couple of days. It takes a toll. Some people are better travelers than others, Even just talking to the public may not come really natural to everybody. Sometimes, it takes a little bit to warm up, but being willing to learn that and being willing to receive that information that may not come from the census, but it may come from a community member who knows a lot about their area and the interests of their communities and their neighbors. That is very valid information. And under the California Constitution, it is definitely valid. And you have to consider it ranked. Criterion number 4, there are other higher ranked criteria, but within criterion number 4, me coming in and telling you where my neighborhood is and not to split it weighs just as much as a city boundary that you are getting from the census or the county boundary. So the commission, once they're seated, they have to be able to weigh trade-offs and make really hard decisions. And oftentimes people are going to say, what, you're going to believe this neighbor over the census? Well, there may be other implications. The commissioners are going to listen to everybody. They're going to hear from everybody. The member of the public that comes in may have just heard that one hearing, so they may be privy to more information at that particular point. So just engaging in a conversation again and deliberating in public and all of that is really important. So what are communities of interest? I kind of alluded to this a little bit. California Constitution Article 21 provides some definitions and provides a definition and some examples, A community of interest is a contiguous population, so it's in one piece, which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. So what do we know here? It's a contiguous population. We talked about contiguity. So we're looking for geography again. In redistricting, you are always dealing with geography. Examples of such shared interests are those common to an urban area, a rural area, an industrial area, or an agricultural area, and those common to areas in which people share similar living standards, use the same transportation facilities, have similar work opportunities, or have access to the same media of communication relevant to the election process. And finally, what are they not? Communities of interest shall not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. This is also an interesting one because there were people that would come in and they would say, well, we all really became a community when we, were walking precincts for our current assembly member. That would be something where I would be highly suspect that actually fits under communities of interest because it does not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, and or political candidates. So that's something that the commission, the applicants will have to weigh and then figure out, does this fit? Does it not fit? Do we take this as a community of interest? Do we not take it as a community of interest? Oftentimes these things are really ambiguous and not necessarily straightforward. That one may have been a little bit more straightforward than others, but it's not that easy. So how do you define communities of interest? You do it through a public input process, which we just heard about in the government code, that solicits information from those that live or work in the community. You can request oral or written testimony about the community. You can request maps to go along with it. Ask for input on what bonds the community, what's the commonality. Tell us about it. What makes you guys a community? Where is the community located? Where are its borders? Can you tell us about the streets? Is it 7th Street to Broadway to, something else to something else? So basically we want to know the boundaries. Does it go up to this particular, to the Safeway or, over to the park? Or is the park included? Or is it just the park? Where are the boundaries? Because to be able to keep something together, you need to know where it is. And you have to have a geography. Because what we do in redistricting is we know something about the geographies, but they're like puzzle pieces about which we know a lot. And then we use those puzzle pieces to put districts together. This is no different. This is just a puzzle piece that we're not getting from the census or from a register of voters. This is a puzzle piece we're getting from a community member. Finally, tell us why it should stay together. Tell us a little bit more about it. I don't know that they necessarily have to talk about that, and some people are better at talking about this than others. But again, trying to entertain people that maybe are not used to talking in public, maybe have never been to a public hearing, but they know about their neighborhoods. They know about their communities. They're coming in, they're saying, we have worked together on whatever topic for so long. And, we really need to stay together for effective representation. We can't be split because we're too small to be split. We won't get any representation if we're that small. Nobody's going to want to deal with us because we're the tiny little fish in the pool. And to still, take that as good public input, just the same way as somebody who's very elegant, who looks the right way, in a suit with the laptop and comes up and has fancy maps and whatnot, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person's information is more valid than the other information. So keeping an open mind and weighing information that you're getting is really a skill that really comes in handy in this process. Let me do one more slide and then, okay. Quick note about communities of interest. They may or may not be supported by quantitative data, such as Census or American Community Survey data, and they don't need to be. There may be conflicting information about a community of interest. They can vary in size and range from small to large. I think the smallest one we've seen have actually been pretty much a census block. And since we don't split census blocks, it's, thank you for telling us about that. You're good. You're fine. But still, sometimes there's something really important going on that census block and people want to make sure. You can get really large ones. You can get multiple counties that come in, and we did have that. Counties that came in or cities that came in that said, we're a community of interest and here is why. So they really range in geography and also in the number of people that are in there, from very small to very, very large. They can have either a current interest, so this is something that's going on right now, or a goal that binds them. So a goal could be, we are all working on the ballpark. We're working on the ballpark that's going to be built here, and we want to make sure that there's going to be parking. So that is a goal that they're going to be working on. Neighborhoods and communities of interest are part of the same criterion, number 4, and they're not ranked within the criterion, not like the other criteria that we have. So that means that they hold the same weight as cities and counties, and that again can cause a little bit of a pushback from especially, boards of supervisors. They're going to go, what do you mean you're going to split this county because you say you have a community of interest here? It's like, okay, well, we're going to listen to you, but we have to weigh it within this particular criterion, because just because you're a county doesn't mean that under the law, you get priority here. You may in the end, but they're going to have to weigh many, many different factors. The law does not limit the kinds of interests that bind a community, with one exception, which is no political parties, candidates, or incumbents, please. So just no politics. If I may, could I just do 2 more little slides, and then I'm done with communities of interest, and then we can break? Is that okay? Okay. So the Constitution talked about economic interest and social interest, just to give you a couple of really quick examples. Current situation could be common employment. We all work for the same big, employer here. Economic opportunities or lack of economic opportunities. We've seen that a lot in areas where perhaps a big employer was going away. They had moved out of state, or something just didn't happen, something closed, a base closure. Imagine things like that. Goals, expanding those opportunities, development, bringing in businesses and jobs. People are working on that. That can combine that can really bind a community. Social interests, oftentimes people talk about schools, a shared culture, transportation and parks that people are organizing around, and they want to stay together because perhaps they're trying to get some funding for a particular transportation system or something. And then goals, improving recreational opportunities or public safety and so forth. Here are a few actual examples from the last redistricting. We had the foothill counties sharing the same watershed, so talk about a very large community of interest in terms of geography. We had communities that came in, they organized around a historic neighborhood. We had cities that came in that had shared transportation corridors. Cities with a commonality of economic interests, think Silicon Valley. I think Jamie's going to show some of these. Areas with a high non-English speaking cultural community. Organized neighborhoods with an active group. Communities organizing around economic development, very frequent. And then coastal communities working to fight offshore drilling. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. And then we can look at Koreatown when we come back. Thank you.
So Karin, if you're ready, we'll begin the presentation again.
I am. Thank you very much. Okay, we did these already. So this is my Koreatown slide. So this, again, just to remind you, we talked about communities of interest and about neighborhoods. So this is a really interesting slide because it pulls together how different people define Koreatown in Los Angeles. So you see all of these different lines here. So if you go out and you talk to people, you will get many, many different responses to the size and the shape and the number of people and so forth that are in Koreatown. Now, of course, as a mapper, if you're confronted with something like that, what you would probably try to do is just draw a line around all of that and just keep it all together. So, make everybody, this is the make everybody happy principle. Sometimes you can't do that, but, sometimes you hope that you can. But this is not a unique example. I think the more you talk to people in a particular jurisdiction about communities of interest, the more variation you're going to get on these. So finally, compactness. To the extent practicable, and where this does not conflict with the criteria above, again, this is a ranked criterion, so it's pretty much toward the bottom. Districts shall be drawn to encourage geographical compactness such that nearby areas of population are not bypassed for more distant population. And Justin has talked about this at length, so I'm going to keep this pretty short. I have a couple of slides on it or a couple of pictures on it. Census geography and population data obviously are used for this because, again, it says don't bypass areas of population. So you're not just looking at geography. This is, in theory, a geographic criterion, but in California, it's geography plus. So all that other stuff that people are talking about does not really apply. And about the really great map slides that Justin was showing, the different shapes and all of that, people have names for almost every district. I mean, there is now a gerrymandered alphabet that looks at districts that have the shape of letters and puts them together. And there are some of the letters in there. I was actually a little bit offended because they have California districts that are clearly not gerrymanders. So I hope that the person who came up with that is listening to these presentations because there may be a little bit of a revision necessary to the gerrymander dictionary or alphabet. But anyway, in California, we have a little bit different compactness. We have a different compactness measure than other people because we have a defined one. And ours is pretty clear. So just because people come in and they call something like the ribbon of shame or things like that, that does not mean that there is actually any shame to that ribbon, okay? That just means it's a district and you need to know more about it before you make a decision about whether or not that is actually something that shouldn't have been drawn or was in any way went against the law. It's cute though, all these, it's cute of course, it's a laugh, but that's oftentimes just all it is. Compactness, again, addresses the geography of the district in general. In general, it's assumed to guard against all types of gerrymandering. It's one of these handcuffing kinds of criteria. So it's trying to keep people within certain lines. And the courts have said that drastic departures from compactness are a signal that something may be amiss. Well, it's a signal. For us in California, it's actually a signal that they should be looking a little bit further and not just come and jump to conclusions right away. That instinct to draw boxes or to draw circles or to draw rectangles is incredibly strong. I think I've probably worked with more commissions than anybody else in redistrictings, and so there's a real partnership that goes on, and it comes up over and over again when there is public testimony, and also the commissioners, they're like, oh, let's just draw a pretty district, something that people understand. And people understand something that looks like a box. And, the predominant idea in everybody's head is that if it looks funny, there must be some funny business going on. And again, to bring them back to this, that is not what it means. It's definitely a frequently asked question. And then hopefully, the public can be educated enough once the commissioners are educated enough to really understand that. There are hundreds of measures that have been developed to measure compactness. California has a definition. So all of those wonderful statisticians that have written books about compactness, all these conferences where they're arguing about compactness, it's all really super interesting, and I wish you well, but for California, we know what we need to do, and it doesn't necessarily have something to do with their compactness measures. Courts have used the eyeball approach and have said that appearances do matter, and that's all fine and well, but again, that may be, applicable in other jurisdictions, not necessarily ours. Some general notes on compactness. It can be really difficult to create a compact district because there are oftentimes trade-offs with other criteria. For example, cities may not be compact, but they're part of a higher ranked criterion. Remember, keeping cities together is up criterion 4. Compactness is criterion 5. These criteria are ranked. The commissioners are going to have to understand that and then apply it, even when there's pushback. It can be difficult to ascertain whether a district is non-compact without having more information. So again, don't just look at it. I know it looks funny, but why does it look funny? Where are the populations? Why is it drawn that way? Are there communities of interest? Just like that one district that Justin was showing, what they call the earmuff district. I mean, apparently there was a logic to it. I don't know the district. I've seen the photos. Justin says that was an okay district. I believe it. And, but you need more information. Nesting 2 compact assembly districts may result in a non-compact Senate district. We'll get to the next criterion. But basically, this also means that just because you have one district layer that works and is compact, when you put it together with another district, the outcome of that may actually not be compact. So it's trickier than you may think. So is this compact? This is the city of Bakersfield. Look at these city boundaries here. This is my favorite piece here. It has this little tail down here. So just imagine you are a redistricting commissioner and you get this geography and you have to keep this together. And then if you're really unlucky, this has perfect population to be an assembly district, right? So you have to keep the city together, and then that is what your boundary looks like. Well, you're going to have some explaining to do because everybody's going to come in, not know anything about this and say, what in the world did you people do, right? This can't be right. So again, you look at something that's funny looking and that is not compact. That does not mean it is not a lawful district under the California redistricting criteria. Compactness is lower than cities. Keep cities together first. Criterion 4, compactness, criterion 5. There's some lessons learned from research. We did a big research project that Jaime actually way back when was also part of. It was a statewide research project that looked at criteria interactions. And the effects on compactness were also measured. And basically, when you tried to draw compact districts, it was harder to draw Section 2 or majority-minority districts under the Federal Voting Rights Act. Preserving city and county boundaries was a little bit harder. And then also respecting communities of interest. So this goes to trade-offs. There are always trade-offs. It's not, even though the criteria are ranked, the commissioners, the applicants, they're going to have to be able to weigh these different criteria and look at the bigger picture and figure out how to implement them. It is not as straightforward as it may seem when you're just looking at the criteria as they're ranked. The last criterion is nesting. To the extent practicable, and where this does not conflict with the criteria above, each Senate district shall be comprised of 2 whole, complete, and adjacent assembly districts, and each Board of Equalization district shall be comprised of 10 whole, complete, and adjacent Senate districts. The newly created districts are used for this criterion. The commissioners are going to have to hire their staff. When they hire their districting line drawing consultant, I would say beware of the line drawing consultant who will tell you the assembly is going to be a little harder, but then the Senate will just nest. So we're going to be done in about 10 minutes because we'll just take those 80 districts and we're going to do 2 for 1 and we're going to be done 10 minutes later or maybe an hour. Sounds good maybe when you're really tired and you haven't slept in a while, but that actually does not work in practice because if you do that and you don't look at all of these districts individually, you may be violating other criteria. Why? First of all, keep in mind that this is the lowest ranked criterion. So everything that's above it is higher, has priority. There are trade-offs with the other criteria. It constrains the line drawing process because when you're just nesting, you're not looking just at what can I do? How can I draw the best Senate district? How can I do that? How can I keep all these communities that I know about and all these cities and counties together in the Senate district? What it basically does, in theory, is it just takes the existing districts, puts them together, and then there you go. You're going home. You're getting a good night of sleep. It may double a wrong if an assembly district did not meet the needs of a community. So let's say the commission was constrained in the way that they had to draw this assembly district. They had to split a city. They had to split a county. They had to split numerous communities of interest. If you're just going in and saying, okay, now we take that, we put it together with another one to make a Senate district, these same communities, these same cities, these same counties may still be split, depending on which way you go when you're putting them together, right? So that is a problem because then all of a sudden it violates higher ranked criteria. Again, this was a research project, and when we tried to do this, this was really very theoretical. This was in the late 2000s. When we did this research project statewide, we definitely saw an effect on city splits and community of interest splits. That was a very big one, and then there's also a potential effect on compactness. Again, we have a very specific compactness criterion, and you really do have to look at these districts one at a time. On the other hand, this is our this is part of our current map. When it works, it works. And our current commission, they looked at these districts and they really tried hard to figure out whether or not they would be able to nest. And some of these districts, they nested. Now, of course, the legislation or the Constitution says they have to be perfectly nested. They have a lot of districts that are almost nested. These are perfectly nested. So these are 4 districts, like 2 assembly districts down here in Southern California that were perfectly put together. They didn't violate any of the higher ranked criteria. So if it works, but it doesn't always work. So let's go back to my initial slide. Qualifications on which candidates will be selected. Analytical skills. It includes the ability to understand technical materials, including maps, statistical info, and resolve complex problems. I think we've heard a lot about the kinds of data that are involved in redistricting that are being used. They will be used daily, and the various complex problems that they will have to grapple with. The ability to be impartial. It includes the ability to evaluate information with an open mind and make decisions that set aside personal views and interests. Let's not kid ourselves. Everybody has an idea of what they're going to be able to do or what something should look like. If they get conflicting information, they should be able to step back and say, okay, well, maybe I just didn't know everything because all of a sudden here I have information that I didn't have before. And I am able to step back and reevaluate my personal views. The appreciation for California's diverse demographics and geography, understanding that California benefits from having effective participation by persons of all demographic characteristics, including race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and economic status. This is really important. We're an incredibly diverse state, and we really benefit, these lines benefit from bringing everybody in and telling us what they know about the state. It's really an enormously informative process. You learn more about California than you would have ever thought possible. It's really pretty amazing. And again, even given all of that, applicants do not need to be experts to be selected. They will become experts in the process, but they will have access to people that can, impart some information and teach them some information, like people like Justin who know absolutely everything there is to know about the Voting Rights Act, maybe people like me that know something about data, and so forth. And the auditor certainly is very well able to bring experts to the table and make sure that that information is available. I want to, before I conclude, I just want to make one more point, which is that you're also looking for somebody who can work with 13 other people. 13 other people that were really kind of selected to not necessarily be the same because they are, again, effective participation. We made a, big outreach project and tried to get people from all different parts of life into this applicant pool. So once you have your applicants, they will need to be able to work together, and they will need to be able to understand each other and work together as a team, because they're going to be spending a lot of time together. And then, probably go on a road show again, like the last Citizens Redistricting Commission, travel together. Not everybody does that very well, but that's also a really important thing, to make sure they understand and select somebody who can actually do that. With that, what's next is line drawing and an illustration of criteria implementation. Thank you very much. I will hand it off to my colleague, Jaime Clark, and she's going to take it from here in about, I'm guessing, 5 minutes. Thank you so much. And any questions?
To set up, is that okay? Well, let's stand down for 5 minutes and let Jaime